Okay, welcome back to section one. So in section one, we're going to go through a couple of slides here, and there's going to be some common questions that you're probably thinking of, or you might be asking yourself, or common questions that I've received as part of putting this course together. And I want to try to address those things over the next couple of slides, and also give you kind of a little history lesson on what makes these analog plugins so popular. What's kind of the deal? So let's just jump into section one here, and let's read along together here. So in section one, I'm calling that the sound of analog bliss. The first question is, so why are analog recordings so popular these days? What's the deal? Well, back in the 60s, 1960 through the 1990s, most of our favorite records were recorded in large format studios using all analog equipment. Everything from large format consoles to hardware compressors, EQs, tape machines. This type of recording took a long time not only to record, but to mix those records. There were a lot of limitations, and you really had to be a great engineer to make something sound professional. In the mid-1990s, along came DAWs, or digital audio workstations, in the studio. This was a revolutionary thing as it streamlined the recording process, and plugins replaced a lot of that analog gear. Things like large format consoles were no longer needed, and the DAW provided unlimited editing capabilities. Even in the very early stages of computer recording, all DAWs came with basic EQs, compressors, reverbs, and delays. You can literally do an entire recording and mixing session and never have to use any equipment outside of the computer. This is fantastic, right? Well, in one sense it is, but we definitely lost something along the way. What we lost in going to a completely digital format and eliminating analog gear from the equation was a certain warmth, a certain sound, a certain character and vibe that all these recordings from the past had. This did not exist in the digital world. So what caused this? It was the elimination of all the analog gear. That gear had a certain sound, a certain character, and a certain vibe. There is a very pleasing thing that happens to sound or audio when you run it through an analog piece of equipment. The circuitry, the transformers, the capacitors, they all leave a sonic footprint on that audio or on that signal. And what we discovered was that the gear had as much to do with the overall sound of the record as the artist or the musicians themselves in some respects. Once this was discovered, the race was on. All these audio software companies were trying to create plugins that did the same thing sonically as the old analog gear. Early on, these plugins were not very good. They didn't sound very realistic. And mostly that reason was because the technology just wasn't available to model or emulate a piece of analog gear accurately. But after about 10 years of plugin companies trying to achieve this, they finally got it to the point where the sound of analog plugins, the emulations, is so close to the sound of the real analog gear that even the most seasoned pro-level engineers have a difficult time hearing the difference between the plugins and the analog equipment. So now we have the ability to achieve the same sonic sound of analog while still only staying in the digital domain. Plugin companies like Waves and Universal Audio and Slate Digital, and there are others, have created plugin emulations of the most famous and most popular analog gear. Some of which, if you wanted to go out and purchase the actual hardware, would cost you tens of thousands of dollars, and now we have a plugin for a fraction of that cost. This means we don't need a rack full of analog outboard gear patched into our DAW rigs. Now we can do it all in the box. However, the way you use these plugins and the way you think about your DAW is different than what you're used to. And in order for us to achieve the sound of our favorite records, we must completely rethink our workflow and treat our DAWs like an analog studio. And that's why you're here. That's why you bought this course. And that's what I'm here to teach you. I'm here to teach you how to think about your digital audio workstation in an analog studio way and to help you achieve that analog sound using today's tools. So another common question that you might have is, who is this training series really for? This series is for both recording musicians and audio engineers who have been doing recording and mixing for about a year and have a good understanding of basic mixing skills as well as how to effectively use EQ and compression. So let me say that again. This series is for someone who has been mixing, I would say, for a minimum of 6 months to about a year, who understands the basic concepts of how to effectively use EQ and compression. That's who this series is really for. Now, the next obvious question is, well, who is this series not really for? I don't recommend this series for if you are an absolute beginner to mixing, or if you're someone who struggles with the basic fundamentals of EQ and compression. If you are someone that's in that boat, then I highly recommend you purchase my EQ and Compression Made Easy series training courses. You really do need to have a basic understanding of EQ and compression so you can learn how to effectively use these plugins, or any kind of third-party plugin for that matter. All these plugins in and of themselves will not help your mixes. They can actually hurt your mixes if you don't know how to use them effectively. Another common question is, what can analog style plugin emulations do to help my mix? And this is how I like to explain it. I like to explain it like this. Once you can achieve a great sounding mix using your stock plugins, and you want to add different tones and different characters or vibe to your mixes, this is where these plugins can really help your mix. Think of it as taking a great sounding mix and adding about 25% of warmth, character, and vibe and feel to your mixes. I'll be using these terms throughout this series a lot. So remember, no plugin can fix a bad mix. Another question you may have is, well, why can't I just use my stock plugins? Well, you can, but the problem is stock plugins are very transparent and very clinical sounding. There is little to no color, no tone, and no vibe. This is what we will learn throughout this series. The advantage to using analog plugin emulations is that you will not only have the color vibe added to your mix, but you'll also have different tone characteristics between these different plugins. So for example, an LA2A compressor and 1176 compressor, they both do the same thing. They compress, just like your stock compressor. However, the LA2A sounds completely different than the 1176. And they both have totally unique sounds to them, and their sound is much more interesting than a stock compressor. So let's say you were to have an LA2A, an 1176, a Neve 33609, an LA2A, and maybe an SSL compressor in your plugin collection. You in fact would then have 5 totally different tools that can be used for much more than compression. This will become much more clear throughout this series. Are there any downsides to using analog plugins? Well, no, not really. The only thing I would caution you is that a lot of third-party plugins, especially the analog style plugins, generally take a lot more CPU power than a stock plugin. So if you have an older computer, you need to be aware of this. This is why I recommend the Universal Audio System. All their plugins run on a DSP chip in their hardware, which will not tax your computer's CPU whatsoever. However, universal audio plugins are not cheap, and neither are a lot of other third-party plugins for that matter. This is an investment to your studio, and you need to look at it in that way. In my opinion, the benefits far outweigh the costs, and if used effectively, your mixes will sound far better. The last question you probably are asking yourself is, what plugins do I need to buy? I know what you're thinking, and the simple answer is none. Even if you not have a single third-party plugin, before you run out and purchase anything, go through this entire series. I'm going to show you several plugins from several different companies and show you how to use them in a real-world application. You will see several versions of the same type of plugin. For example, we're going to look at 3 to 4 different tape machine plugins by different manufacturers. This series will not only show you how to mix with them, but we will also compare them to each other, so you can decide for yourself which ones you may want to go out and demo, or which ones you may actually want to go out and purchase. So for now, just wait. There'll be plenty of time to go shopping in the future, soon enough, I promise. So now that we've taken a look at Section 1, come on back for Section 2, and we are going to jump into Studio One into our DAW, and we are going to start working with some of these plugins.